So lately I've been thinking a lot about the Steam Deck versus the Switch 2. You've probably seen loads of comparison videos on YouTube already, talking about things like battery life, raw power, game libraries, all that kind of stuff. But there is one thing that after using both devices side by side, there's one comparison that I don't see talked about very often, and that is how these devices handle older games. So that's what we're going to talk about today. On the initial release of Switch 2, I played loads of Mario Kart World and I enjoyed the extra power that the Switch 2 had over Switch 1. Sure, the battery life was worse than what I was expecting, but I was really enjoying the 1080p screen in handheld and even higher resolution than that when docked. And for a while, it actually got me wondering if maybe going forwards, I'd prefer my Switch 2 over my Steam Deck because of that extra power. If you docked a Steam Deck, the resolution felt really stretched out and pixelated over a bigger screen, but then on the other hand, if you increase the resolution to compensate, the performance got worse in a lot of cases. Docking the Switch 2 though just gives you more power without any compromises. So I was mulling it over, but then there weren't really that many games that released on Switch 2, so in the following months I didn't play it too much until recently. Both Donkey Kong Bonanza and the Switch 2 edition of Kirby and the Forgotten Land both run great and they look fantastic on the Switch 2. And so that got me thinking about the extra power of the Switch 2 again and wondering how to use it. And well, it just kind of turns out that's quite hard to do. Since the console is new and there aren't that many releases, instead I started to look back through my old Switch library. There's been plenty of games in my Switch 1 backlog, and so I thought I'd have a great time by playing them and taking advantage of that Switch 2 hardware. So at the moment there are two ways that Switch 1 games run better on Switch 2. The first is that the developers have actually gone in and patched the game. So for example, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet ran pretty poorly on Switch 1, but thanks to a patch, they run so much better on Switch 2, it almost feels like a brand new game. The other way is if a game had variable resolution or wasn't quite reaching its target FPS on Switch 1, and these games will automatically just run better on Switch 2 because they were able to take advantage of that extra power. However, that is only true up to a certain point. A lot of games are still capped to a maximum frame rate of 30 FPS, and the same is true of resolution. No Switch 1 game is able to run at a better resolution than 720p in handheld. So then you have games that already meet their target frame rate and resolution on Switch 1, and these games actually still run exactly the same on Switch 2. So it's actually a bit disappointing. Here we are playing the new iteration of the Switch as a much more powerful handheld, and yet we're seeing really very limited upgrades in performance when running older games. In some cases that's to be expected, but what made matters worse for me is I actually think that in a lot of cases Switch 1 games look worse when playing handheld on Switch 2 because that 720p resolution is being stretched out over a 1080p screen. This might not be a problem for everyone who gets a Switch 2, but I noticed it pretty quickly, and so while technically so many Switch 1 games are backwards compatible on Switch 2, I'm actually not sure that it's the best place to play them. I don't like playing them so much on Switch 2. And so this is a key way that the Steam Deck wins out for me. Well, I say Steam Deck, but really it's true of handheld PCs in general, and it's just because of how PC gaming works. You have the ability to go into the settings and change the graphics options. So if you're playing on what is now a more powerful machine, you're going to be able to take advantage of that extra power straight away. You won't be capped to 30 FPS, you'll be able to pick a resolution that matches your screen, and then you can adjust the graphics settings as much as you want to match that. And a lot of people do actually love to use their Steam Decks this way. Plenty of people, they take games from the days of the PS3 or the Xbox 360 that run great on Steam Deck hardware, and they just have loads of fun playing through their favorite older titles because the hardware will allow them to run at 60 FPS on max graphics, or at least come close. Not to mention you'll have games that still run better on Steam Deck than on Switch 2, even though Switch 2 is newer and more powerful, because on Steam Deck there's no waiting for a patch to allow the game to make full use of the hardware. So at this point you might be thinking, well, yes, it is very useful to go into a PC game and change the graphics settings, but it's also nothing new, and console players might not want that extra hassle. And I do agree with that, but I think that now that backwards compatibility is becoming much bigger of a thing, this actually might start to become an issue even for console players. Let's look to the future, say 5 to 10 years time. Players are already building up huge libraries on their chosen device, whether that's a console, a handheld, PC, hybrid, whatever. An important factor to most players, I think, will be taking those libraries with them to the next generation. And I think all of the big console manufacturers get that now, even Nintendo gets that now. Let's imagine the Nintendo Switch 3 comes out, and again it has a pretty big increase in power and performance. Switch 3 games look and play amazingly on it, but Switch 1 and Switch 2 games, which will probably probably be backwards compatible and so technically playable on Switch 3, they probably will still be locked to the performance that they released with on their original console. They'll have the same resolution and FPS caps, and so they'll be waiting on a patch that for a lot of games will just never come. On the other hand, let's say a Steam Deck 2 releases. Now Valve have said that they wouldn't do a Steam Deck 2 until they had a really good reason to, so I would imagine that any Steam Deck 2 has a big hardware bump over the first one, and probably also has a 1080p screen as well. Any game that you bought to play on your first Steam Deck will instantly be able to take advantage of that extra power. You'll be able to bump the resolution if you want to, it won't be capped at specific frame rates, so it will automatically be able to run at better frames, and all this without having to wait for a patch from a developer to unlock that extra potential. It's not something that I thought of straight away, but now that I've had the idea, it's something that I really do think is going to become a bigger and bigger factor, at least it is for me. Switch 2 may perform better now, but that's only true for games that have specifically been patched to run better or are original Switch 2 releases. Now, this isn't the first time that we're seeing this. If you run a PS4 game on PS5, for example, it's probably also capped to a lower resolution or frame rate than what the PS5 could actually achieve. Bloodborne is a massive example of this, with plenty of fans crying out for a patch that just hasn't come, but I think it was a little bit less noticeable on a home console. First of all, not everyone had 4K TVs, and even if they do, we're still used to seeing 1080p content on a 4K TV because of things like streaming TV shows and movies. Not every piece of content that we watch on a TV is 4K. The problem here on Switch 2 is that if you buy that console, you already automatically have that better handheld screen. You're already playing on a 1080p screen, and yet in most cases the games you play won't yet be at that 1080p resolution. Within the last few months, I upgraded my PC monitor from a 1080p screen to a 1440p resolution screen, and let me tell you, without changing anything else, that immediately felt like almost like I was upgrading the graphics just from seeing that resolution bump. And I would love to have that experience on a console as well, but you can't really do that at the moment because even if you upgrade the screen, everything's locked. On top of that, really, I think that 720p these days is quite outdated, and so it's much more noticeable when you're locked into that. At least when we made the jump between Game Boy and Game Boy Advance and DS and 3DS, there were options to lock the aspect ratio or the resolution to how the games were originally supposed to be played, but here we're forced to still take that 720p resolution but stretch it out over the bigger screen. Even if they just gave us the option to introduce extra bezels in order to keep the game running at the intended resolution, then I think that would at least be a better option. I'm not saying I would always want to take it, but at least give us the option so players can make the choice themselves. Now, we have started to see console games get a few graphics settings. For now, it's just performance versus fidelity to help keep things simple, but maybe eventually we'll start to see a few more options separated out for things like resolution, frame rate cap, and graphics. If from now on every console generation in the future is backwards compatible with all of the ones before it, then I think they'll have to do something at some point. Otherwise, devices like the Steam Deck and PCs, or just handheld PCs in general, are already going to have that natural advantage when it comes to running your older games. Now, maybe Nintendo does have a long-term plan for this, but I would have thought that now, the first few months of the Switch 2, is the perfect time to be giving us a steady stream of these patches. You know, maybe just 2 or 3 games every month to upgrade them to work better on the Switch 2. Now, we have had a couple more announcements, Mario Wonder Switch 2 Edition, for example, but still only a very small number of Switch 1 games that can take full advantage of the hardware. I'm not a developer, so I could be totally wrong, but I would have thought that the patches would be quick wins to keep people playing on the shiny new console. And you might even get a few new sales of these older games for people who didn't play a game on Switch 1, but are interested now that it has a Switch 2 patch. And you might even sell some extra Switch 2 consoles. There's probably plenty of people now that are waiting because there are only a few Switch 2 games, but imagine if those people saw more and more Switch 1 games getting patched to run better on the Switch 2. That would just be another reason to buy the new console. For now though, I can't help but think that backwards compatibility, well, it's just so much more flexible and rewarding on Steam Deck than it is on, say, Switch 2 or home consoles in general. And I just think that that's going to become a bigger and bigger factor down the line when choosing a console or device that's going to carry our libraries forward over the next few generations. So I'd love to know what you think about this as well. Do you think, like me, this is going to become an important factor down the line as we build up bigger and bigger backwards compatible libraries? Or do you think really it's not that big of a deal because not that many people play their older games anymore and they just focus on the new ones that come out for the new system? I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.